I was coming back from the garage Thursday evening when I heard Genesis laughing in the living room. Not her normal laugh, the kind of laugh that made me stop in the hallway instead of walking in. She had 3 of her friends over and I could hear Hannah asking about the photographer they'd hired. Yeah, a photographer for a divorce announcement party. Let me back up because this is going to sound insane and I need you all to understand how we got here. Genesis and I have been married for 8 years. We met in college when I was working on this startup idea with 2 buddies from my computer science program. She was in business management and we connected at some entrepreneurship mixer back then. I was full of energy and big plans and she seemed genuinely excited about what I was building. We got married 6 months after graduation because we were young and stupid and thought love was enough. Here's where it gets complicated. My startup didn't just fail, it spectacularly failed. We'd gotten some initial angel investor interest and I'd convinced Genesis to move across the country with me so we could be closer to potential funding sources. Then the whole thing collapsed when our lead investor pulled out and my 2 partners bailed to take corporate jobs. I was 24 years old, married for less than a year, stuck in an expensive city with no job and a wife who'd relocated her entire life for my dream. Genesis got a job in sales at a tech company within 2 weeks. She was good at it too. Really good. Within 3 years, she was making 6 figures with bonuses and climbing fast. Meanwhile, I was bouncing between contract work and trying to get another venture off the ground. Every attempt fizzled. I'd get close to something promising and then it would fall apart for one reason or another. The market shifted. The technology became obsolete. A competitor beat us to launch. I wasn't sitting around playing video games all day like she'd eventually start implying to her friends. I was working my tail off on these projects. But working hard and making money are 2 different things. And Genesis was paying for literally everything. The rent on our apartment, groceries, her car payment and mine, insurance, everything. I contributed when I could from freelance gigs, but it was maybe 20% of our household expenses on a good year. And I could feel her resentment growing. It started small little comments about how tired she was from carrying us financially. Then it became jokes at dinner parties about her supporting a dependent. Then it stopped being jokes at all. She'd come home from work and I could see her looking at me with this expression that was half disgust and half contempt, like I was something stuck to the bottom of her shoe. I'm not going to lie and say I was some perfect husband during this time. I was depressed, frustrated, angry at myself for failing over and over, but I was still trying. I was still applying for jobs and pitching ideas and doing the freelance work. It just wasn't enough for her. Nothing was enough once she decided I was a failure. About a year ago, I finally landed a stable, remote position with decent pay. Not amazing but solid. I started contributing more to our expenses. Genesis barely acknowledged it. By then she'd already checked out of our marriage. She'd stay late at work constantly. She'd go on these weekend trips with her girlfriends. She'd spend hours on her phone texting and laughing at things she'd never share with me. I knew something was coming. I just didn't know what. So, Thursday evening, I'm standing in the hallway listening to my wife plan her exit strategy with her 3 closest friends. Hannah was asking about the photographer again, and Genesis explained that she wanted professional photos of the moment she told me she was leaving, not just for herself, but to share with people. She wanted documentation of my reaction when she announced she was done with me. Arlene asked what the plan was exactly, and Genesis laid it all out. She was going to throw herself a party, call it a celebration with friends, but really it was her freedom party. Her liberation from 8 years of being tied to a worthless husband who couldn't provide for himself. She'd already rented a small event space for Saturday evening and invited about 30 people, friends, colleagues, some family members, everyone except me, obviously. The plan was to get me there under false pretenses. She was going to tell me it was a surprise party for her work promotion and that I needed to show up at 7 o'clock. When I walked in, everyone would yell, "Surprise!" And then Genesis would make her big announcement. She'd tell everyone assembled that she was leaving me, that she was finally free, that she'd been carrying dead weight for almost a decade and she was done. Daphne asked if Genesis was worried I'd make a scene, and Genesis actually laughed at that. She said I was too pathetic to do anything but maybe cry or beg. She hoped I'd beg actually, because that would make the photos even better. She wanted to remember this moment forever. The moment she took her life back from the loser she'd married. Hannah brought up Derek, asked if he'd be there. Genesis got all excited talking about him. Apparently, she'd been seeing this guy Judah for about 4 months. He's some executive at a different tech company, has a penthouse downtown, drives an expensive car. All the things I wasn't and didn't have. Genesis said Judah was going to be at the party, but he'd stay low-key until after her announcement. Then he'd come over and put his arm around her, and everyone would understand she was moving up in life. They talked about logistics for a while. The photographer would be positioned to catch my face when Genesis made her speech. Arlene volunteered to film it on her phone as backup footage. They'd ordered a custom cake that said freedom on it. Genesis had even bought a new dress for the occasion, something expensive and stunning because she wanted to look amazing when she destroyed me in front of 36 people. I stood there in the hallway absorbing every word. And here's the thing nobody knows. Here's the part that's going to make this whole situation absolutely wild. I wasn't shocked. I wasn't even surprised really. I'd been watching Genesis pull away for over a year. I'd seen the signs, the late nights, the secret texting, the way she looked at me like I was garbage. But more importantly, I'd been preparing for something like this for a long time. See, the house we live in isn't some rental apartment. It's a 3-bedroom house in a decent neighborhood that my grandmother left me when she passed away 5 years ago. Genesis moved in with me, obviously, and we've been living here ever since. But here's what she doesn't know and never bothered to ask. The house is in my name, only my name. It was inherited property and I never added her to the deed. Genesis pays for most of our daily expenses, but she's been living in my house rent-free for 5 years. She assumes we own it together. She's made comments about our house and our equity, but legally she has zero claim to this property. I checked with a lawyer 2 years ago when things started getting really bad between us. The lawyer confirmed that in our state, inherited property stays separate unless I explicitly put her name on the deed, which I never did. I've been sitting on this information, waiting, not because I'm some evil genius, but because I wanted to be absolutely certain before I used it. And listening to her plan my public humiliation with her friends while discussing her affair partner, who's already lined up to replace me, gave me that certainty. I walked into the living room. All 4 of them stopped talking immediately and looked at me with these guilty expressions. I smiled at everyone and asked if they needed anything, drinks or snacks or whatever. Genesis recovered quickly and said they were fine. I nodded and went upstairs to our bedroom. I pulled out my phone and started making calls. First, I called my lawyer, asked him to prepare eviction paperwork for Genesis to be served Sunday morning. He'd already drawn up the documents months ago when I'd first consulted him about my options. All he needed was my go-ahead to file them. I gave it. Then I called the property management company I'd contacted about possibly renting out the house if I ever needed to. Asked them about changing the locks on Sunday. They said they could have someone there by 9 a.m. Then I called my bank, removed Genesis as an authorized user on my accounts. She had her own separate bank accounts for her salary, but she'd been added to mine years ago for household expenses. I took her off effective immediately. I did a few other things. Canceled the phone plan that had both our phones on it and opened a new individual plan. Transferred my number. Her phone would stop working by Saturday evening, logged into our shared streaming accounts, and removed her access. Petty maybe, but I wasn't leaving her anything that connected her to me. The next day, Genesis was practically bouncing around the house with excitement. She kept disappearing to make phone calls about the party. At one point, she asked me what I was doing Saturday evening, and I said, "Nothing special." She got this pleased look on her face and said, "Perfect." Because she had a surprise for me, something for us to celebrate together. I needed to meet her at this address at 7 sharp. I said, "Sure, absolutely. I'd be there." Saturday came and Genesis spent the entire day getting ready. Hair appointment, nail appointment. She came home with shopping bags from expensive stores, her new dress, I assumed. She did her makeup for over an hour, put on jewelry, the works. She looked incredible, honestly, like she was getting ready for the event of her life, which I guess she was. She left the house around 5 to go set up at the venue, Told me again to be there at 7 o'clock and don't be late. I watched her drive away in her car that I'd been making payments on for the last 3 years, another thing she assumed was hers. Another thing that legally wasn't. I got dressed, nothing fancy, jeans and a button-down shirt. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I drove to the address she'd given me and pulled into the parking lot of this small event space at exactly 7 p.m. I could see through the windows that it was packed with people. Genesis had really gone all out. I walked in and everyone yelled, "Surprise!" just like Genesis had planned. There were balloons and decorations and that freedom cake on a table in the corner. I saw the photographer positioned off to the side with his camera ready. I saw Arlene holding up her phone. I saw Hannah and Daphne standing near Genesis looking excited and nervous. And I saw Genesis herself in the center of the room wearing her expensive new dress looking absolutely triumphant. She walked over to me and I could see she was trying not to smile too big yet. She wanted to savor this moment. She called everyone to attention and said she had an announcement to make. A big announcement about her future and her happiness and finally putting herself first. Everyone got quiet. The photographer raised his camera. Arlene had her phone recording. Genesis looked right at me and said, "Surprise." She wasn't here to celebrate anything with me. She was here to celebrate her freedom from me. She was leaving me. She was done being married to someone who couldn't support himself. Done carrying the financial burden. Done pretending she was happy. She was moving on with her life and moving up with someone who actually had something to offer her. People gasped. A few looked uncomfortable. Most looked shocked. This apparently wasn't what they'd expected when they got the party invitation. Genesis was still looking at me, waiting for me to react, waiting for me to break down or beg or give her the satisfaction of seeing me destroyed. I just smiled. And that's when her expression started to change. Update 1. Okay, so the comments on the first post from Hidden Lies have been absolutely wild and I appreciate everyone who told me I did the right thing to answer some questions. Yes, I'm serious about all of this. No, I'm not making it up for karma. And yes, I understand this is nuclear. That's exactly what I wanted. Let me tell you what happened after I smiled at Genesis in front of 30 people. She looked confused first, like she couldn't process why I wasn't falling apart on command. She'd built up this whole fantasy in her head about how I'd react and my actual reaction was breaking her script. She recovered fast, though, and said something about how typical it was, that I couldn't even take this seriously, that I was probably in shock or denial or whatever. I told her I wasn't in shock at all. I'd heard her planning this whole thing on Thursday evening when she had her friends over. Every single detail. The photographer, the cake, the speech, her boyfriend Judah, who was apparently lurking somewhere in this crowd, waiting for his cue to come claim his prize. The room got very quiet after that. Genesis's face went from confused to angry in about 2 seconds. She said I'd been eavesdropping on a private conversation, and that was a violation of her privacy. I pointed out it was hard not to overhear when she was cackling about it in our living room, but sure, let's talk about violations. Hannah stepped forward and said I needed to calm down. That Genesis had every right to leave a marriage that wasn't working and I was being manipulative by trying to make her feel bad about it. I wasn't trying to make anyone feel anything. Actually, I was just done pretending. Genesis rallied at that point. She told the whole room that yes, she was leaving me and yes, she'd been seeing someone else because she deserved to be with a man who could actually provide for her. She'd spent 8 years supporting a husband who couldn't hold down a real job. She'd carried us financially while I chased one failed dream after another. She was done being married to someone who brought nothing to the table. And look, I'm not going to stand here and say she was completely wrong about everything. I had failed at multiple business ventures. I had been financially dependent on her for most of our marriage. Those are facts. But here's what she conveniently left out of her narrative. I told everyone in that room that Genesis had moved into my house 5 years ago when my grandmother passed away and left it to me. That she'd been living there rent-free ever since. That every dollar she'd spent on our daily expenses, she would have been spending anyway on rent somewhere else. Except she got to live in a 3-bedroom house in a nice neighborhood without paying for it. I told them the house was solely in my name, inherited property that I'd never added her to, that legally she had no claim to it whatsoever. Genesis went pale. She said that was ridiculous. That was our house. We'd lived there together for 5 years. She'd paid for utilities and groceries and everything else. She had rights. I explained that actually she didn't. I'd consulted with a lawyer about this exact scenario, and in our state, inherited property remains separate marital property unless explicitly transferred, which it hadn't been. She'd been living in my house as essentially a guest who happened to be my wife. The photographer had stopped taking pictures. Arlene had lowered her phone. The whole crowd was watching this play out, and it was definitely not the entertainment Genesis had promised them. Daphne tried to jump in and defend Genesis. Said it didn't matter whose name was on the deed because they'd built a life there together. Genesis had invested in that home. She'd made it a home. I agreed that sure, she'd bought groceries and paid the electric bill. She was welcome to take any furniture or belongings she'd personally purchased, but the house itself and everything I'd owned before the marriage stayed with me. Genesis was starting to panic now. I could see her brain working through the implications. She asked where she was supposed to go. I told her that wasn't really my problem, but she might want to check with Judah about his penthouse accommodation since she'd been planning to move up in life anyway. That's when Judah himself finally revealed himself. He'd been standing near the back, looking uncomfortable through this whole thing. He came forward and put his arm around Genesis like she'd planned, but the gesture looked offensive now instead of triumphant. He said I was being unreasonable and vindictive. That Genesis deserved better than this treatment. I asked Judah how long he'd been sleeping with my wife. He said that wasn't relevant. I said it was relevant to me since I'd apparently been paying for the phone she used to text him and the car she drove to meet him and the roof over her head while she was planning her exit strategy with her affair partner. Genesis told me I was being cruel, that she'd stayed with me far longer than she should have because she'd felt sorry for me. That she'd tried to help me succeed, but I just kept failing. That eventually she'd had to accept I was never going to be the man she needed and she deserved to find happiness somewhere else. I told her she absolutely deserved to find happiness starting immediately because the eviction notice would be served at the house tomorrow morning and she had 30 days to remove her belongings and vacate the property. She said I couldn't do that. I said actually I could and I was. I'd already filed the paperwork with my lawyer. She'd be served official notice at 9 a.m. Sunday. Genesis started yelling at me then. Called me vindictive and petty and cruel. Said I was punishing her for being honest about wanting to leave. That this was exactly why she had fallen out of love with me. I was small and mean and couldn't handle that she'd outgrown me. I stayed calm through all of this. Honestly, it felt good to finally stop pretending everything was fine, to stop walking on eggshells around her resentment. I'd spent 2 years watching her slowly destroy whatever affection we'd had, and I was done caring about her feelings. Hannah said Genesis could stay with her while she figured things out, that she didn't need to stay with someone who clearly didn't appreciate her. I said that was great, and Genesis should probably start making calls because she'd also lost access to the bank accounts. I'd had her on and her phone was going to stop working in about an hour when the service plan I'd canceled kicked in. Genesis pulled out her phone immediately. Tried to open her banking app. It wouldn't load. She tried calling someone and the call wouldn't go through. She looked at me with this expression of complete disbelief and rage. She said I'd cut off her phone, her bank access. I was trying to trap her with no resources. I pointed out she had her own bank accounts with her own salary that I'd never had access to. She wasn't trapped. She just didn't have access to my accounts anymore and the phone plan I'd been paying for was canceled because I wasn't paying for anything else for her. Judah said he'd take care of Genesis, that she didn't need anything from me. He had plenty of resources and she'd be better off with him anyway. I told him that was perfect and he should definitely take her home to his penthouse tonight since she'd be getting evicted from my house in 30 days. Genesis was crying now. Not sad crying, angry crying. She said I'd planned this, that I'd known about the party and deliberately set up this whole situation to humiliate her in front of everyone. I said she'd literally hired a photographer to capture my humiliation. So, yes, I turned her plan around on her. I'd had years to prepare for something like this, and she'd finally given me the perfect moment to execute it. The party was completely dead at this point. People were standing around awkwardly. The freedom cake sat untouched on the table. Genesis's big moment of liberation had turned into her finding out she'd been living in her husband's house for 5 years with no legal claim to it while planning to publicly destroy him. Arlene suggested everyone should probably leave. Give Genesis and me space to work this out privately. I said there was nothing to work out. Genesis wanted her freedom and she was getting it. She just wasn't getting my house or my money or my phone plan along with it. Genesis told me I was going to regret this. That she'd fight the eviction. That she'd get a lawyer and prove she had rights to the house because she'd been living there and maintaining it. I said she was welcome to try, but my lawyer had already confirmed my legal position was solid. Inherited property never added her to the deed. She'd been living there during our marriage, but that didn't give her ownership rights. Judah said they should leave, that Genesis didn't need to stay here and be attacked by me. I said I wasn't attacking anyone. I was just declining to continue supporting my wife's lifestyle while she planned her exit to another man's penthouse. They left. Genesis, Judah, Hannah, Arlene, and Daphne. Most of the party guests filtered out behind them, looking uncomfortable and confused. I stayed long enough to talk to the venue manager about the mess and who was responsible for cleanup. Turns out, Genesis had paid for the rental, so that wasn't my problem. I drove home to my house, the house that was about to be just mine again. I'd lived there with Genesis for 5 years, and before that, I'd lived there with my grandmother for 2 years before she passed. It had always been my space, and Genesis had just been occupying it. Sunday morning, the process server showed upright on schedule at 9 a.m. I'd left the house early to grab breakfast and let him do his job. I didn't need to be there for that part. When I came back around 10 o'clock, the paperwork had been delivered, and Genesis had apparently already called Hannah to come pick her up. My phone started ringing around 11 o'clock. Not Genesis because her phone was shut off, but Hannah calling from her phone. She demanded to know what I thought I was doing. Kicking Genesis out of her home, cutting off her access to everything, treating her like a criminal when all she'd done was be honest about her feelings. I explained again that it wasn't Genesis's home. It was to my home. That she'd been living there as my wife, and now she wasn't going to be my wife anymore, so she needed to find somewhere else to live. Hannah said I was being vindictive and cruel. And this was exactly why Genesis had wanted to leave me, because I was small and petty and couldn't handle her success. I asked Hannah if she'd known about the affair with Judah. She said Genesis's relationship with Judah wasn't an affair because the marriage had been emotionally over for years. Genesis had just been trying to find a way out that wouldn't destroy me, but I'd forced her hand by being so controlling and manipulative. I hung up on her. The thing is, I knew Genesis wasn't going to just accept this and move on quietly. She'd built this whole narrative in her head about how she was the victim of a failed husband, and now I disrupted that story. She was going to fight back. She was going to try to make me look like the villain. And honestly, I was ready for it. I'd spent 2 years watching her pull away and resent me. And I'd used that time to prepare for exactly this scenario. Everything I'd done was legal. Everything I'd done was protecting what was mine. If she wanted to fight me, she was welcome to try, but she wasn't doing it from my house. Update 2. Alright, so I'm seeing a lot of comments asking what happened next and whether Genesis just accepted the eviction and moved on. Short answer, absolutely not. This woman spent 8 years convinced she was the martyr in our marriage, and she wasn't about to let me flip that script without a fight. Monday morning, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. Turned out to be a lawyer Genesis had hired, some guy named Rivers who specialized in family law. He explained that he was representing Genesis in the dissolution of our marriage, and he wanted to discuss the property situation. Specifically, he wanted to talk about how we were going to equitably divide the marital home. I told Rivers the same thing I'd told Genesis. The house was inherited property in my name only. There was no marital home to divide. He said that was a very simplistic view of the situation and that Genesis had legitimate claims based on her contributions to the household during our marriage. She'd paid for utilities, maintenance, improvements to the property. She'd lived there as my wife for 5 years and established it as her legal residence. I asked Rivers if he'd actually reviewed the deed and the inheritance documentation. He said he had, and yes, the house was technically in my name, but that didn't negate Genesis's rights as a spouse who'd contributed to the household. I told him my own lawyer had already confirmed my legal position, and if Genesis wanted to fight the eviction in court, she was welcome to waste her money trying. Rivers got a bit more aggressive then. Said I was clearly acting out of spite and vindictiveness, that I was punishing Genesis for wanting to end an unhappy marriage, that my behavior at the party and my immediate filing for eviction showed a pattern of controlling and abusive behavior. I actually laughed at that. The woman who'd planned to publicly humiliate me in front of 30 people while her affair partner waited in the wings was now claiming I was abusive because I wouldn't let her keep living in my house for free. I told Rivers to have Genesis communicate through him from now on if she wanted, but my position wasn't changing. The eviction stood. She had 30 days minus the 2 days that had already passed. I hung up and immediately my phone started ringing again. This time it was Genesis calling from Hannah's phone. She was absolutely furious. She said she'd just gotten off the phone with her lawyer and she couldn't believe I was going to force her into court over this. That she'd spent 5 years making that house a home and I was throwing her out like trash. I reminded Genesis that she'd literally hired a photographer to document my reaction to her leaving me. That she'd planned this whole party specifically to humiliate me publicly, that she'd been having an affair for 4 months while living in my house and using my resources. So, yeah, I was throwing her out. She said the affair with Judah didn't count because our marriage had been dead for over a year. I'd emotionally abandoned her by being such a failure. She tried to stay and support me, but I just kept failing at everything I attempted. She'd needed someone who could actually be a partner, and Judah gave her that. I asked Genesis why she hadn't just left then. If the marriage had been dead for over a year, why had she stayed? She said she'd been trying to figure out the logistics, trying to find the right time, trying to be compassionate about it because she knew I'd be devastated. I pointed out that hiring a photographer to capture my devastation wasn't exactly compassionate. She said that was different. That had been her way of reclaiming her power after years of being dragged down by me. She'd needed that moment for herself. We went back and forth like this for almost an hour. Genesis kept trying to make me see her side. How hard it had been for her, how much she'd sacrificed, how she deserved better than what I'd given her. And honestly, some of it was valid. She had supported us financially for most of our marriage. She had paid for most of our expenses. But she'd also been living rent-free in a house that would have cost her at least $2,000 a month to rent elsewhere. I finally told Genesis that I understood she felt justified in leaving. That was fine. She could leave, but she wasn't taking my house with her. She wasn't taking anything that was mine. She could take her clothes and her personal belongings and anything she'd purchased herself, but everything else stayed. She said, "What about the furniture? The couch and the dining table and the bedroom set?" I said if she'd bought them with her money, she could take them. She said she'd bought most of the furniture because I'd been broke when we got married. I told her, fine, take the furniture. Take whatever she'd paid for. I didn't care about the furniture. She asked about the car. I'd been making payments on her car for 3 years. Was I going to take that too? I said the car was in both our names, but I'd been making the payments, so we'd need to sort that out through the lawyers. She could keep driving it for now, but she'd need to refinance it in her own name or buy me out of my share. Genesis started crying at that point. Said I was systematically stripping away everything she had, that I was being cruel and vindictive, and this wasn't the man she'd married. I said the man she'd married had failed at 3 startups and spent most of his 20s financially dependent on his wife. Maybe she was right that I'd changed. She hung up on me. Tuesday, Genesis showed up at the house. I'd had the locks changed Monday afternoon like I'd planned, but she still came to the door and started pounding on it, demanding I let her in. She needed to get more of her things. She needed to start packing if I was really going to force her out. I opened the door, but didn't let her in. Told her she could come get her belongings on Saturday when I'd be there to supervise. She said she didn't need supervision in her own home. I said it wasn't her home. And yes, she did need supervision because I didn't trust her not to damage something or take things that weren't hers. She said I was being ridiculous, that she wasn't going to vandalize the house. I said she'd also told her friends she couldn't wait to see my stupid face when she humiliated me, so forgive me if I didn't trust her judgment anymore. Genesis's mom called me Wednesday. I hadn't talked to Rivers or Genesis since Tuesday, and apparently they'd escalated to family involvement. Her mom said she'd always liked me and she was sad to see the marriage ending. But she thought I was handling this very poorly. Genesis was her daughter and she was hurting and I was making everything worse by being so harsh. I explained to her mom what Genesis had actually done. The party, the photographer, the affair with Judah. The plan to publicly destroy me. Her mom went quiet for a minute and then said that didn't sound like Genesis. That her daughter wouldn't do something that cruel. I told her to ask Genesis about it or ask Hannah or Arlene or Daphne who'd all been part of planning it. Her mom said even if that was true, it didn't justify kicking Genesis out of her home. I explained again that it wasn't Genesis's home, that it was inherited property in my name only. Her mom said that wasn't fair, that Genesis had lived there for 5 years and built a life there, that she'd contributed to that household even if her name wasn't on the deed. I said contributing to household expenses wasn't the same as having ownership rights. And if Genesis's lawyer wanted to argue otherwise in court, he was welcome to try. Her mom said I'd become cold. And she didn't recognize me anymore. I said, maybe I had changed. Maybe I'd gotten tired of being treated like a failure and a burden. Thursday, Genesis showed up at the house again. This time, she had Judah with her. He knocked on the door and told me they needed to talk. I said, we didn't need to talk about anything. He said, actually, we did because this situation was affecting Genesis's mental health, and he wanted me to reconsider the eviction. I asked Judah how long he'd been sleeping with my wife. He said that wasn't relevant. I said it was relevant to me since he was now standing on my porch asking me to let my wife continue living in my house while she moved on with him. Judah said the affair had started after the marriage was already over emotionally, that Genesis had been miserable and lonely, and he'd just been someone who understood her, who appreciated her, who could actually provide for her the way she deserved. I said that was great and he should definitely provide for her by letting her move into his penthouse. He said his living situation was complicated right now. I asked what that meant. He said he actually lived with a roommate and it wasn't really set up for Genesis to move in. I started laughing. Genesis had been telling her friends about Judah's penthouse and how she was moving from basement loser to penthouse princess, but apparently the penthouse came with a roommate and no room for her. Genesis stepped forward then and said this wasn't about Judah's place. This was about me being vindictive and cruel. She'd made a mistake with how she'd handled the breakup, but that didn't mean I got to destroy her life. I said I wasn't destroying her life. I was just not continuing to house her while she moved on with someone else. Judah said I was being unreasonable. That Genesis needed time to find a place and get her finances sorted. That 30 days wasn't enough time. I said 30 days was what the law required and she'd already used 4 of them standing on my porch arguing instead of apartment hunting. Genesis said she couldn't afford first month's rent and security deposit on a decent place right now because most of her savings had gone toward the party and the photographer and her new clothes. I said that was unfortunate but not my problem. Maybe Judah could help her out since he was so invested in her well-being. Judah actually looked uncomfortable at that. Said he'd love to help, but he had some financial commitments right now that made things tight. Genesis looked at him when he said that. I could see her processing what was happening. Her affair partner with the supposedly successful executive lifestyle couldn't actually afford to help her. They left after that, but I knew this wasn't over. Genesis wasn't going to accept that she'd miscalculated everything, that her grand exit plan had blown up in her face, that the man she'd been ready to replace me with wasn't actually ready to step up and support her. Friday afternoon, I was at the grocery store when I ran into Daphne. She saw me and immediately came over. Said she needed to talk to me about what I was doing to Genesis, that Genesis was staying on Hannah's couch and falling apart, that she'd lost her home and her husband and her stability all in 1 week. I told Daphne that Genesis hadn't lost anything she'd actually owned. She'd lost access to things that were mine. Daphne said that was a horrible way to look at a marriage. That when people built a life together, they shared everything. I said we'd shared plenty. Genesis had shared my house rent-free for 5 years. She'd shared my phone plan and my bank accounts and my car payments. And now she didn't get to share them anymore. Daphne said I was punishing Genesis for being honest about her feelings. I said I was protecting myself from someone who'd planned to publicly humiliate me. Daphne said the party had been a mistake, but Genesis had just been trying to reclaim her power. I asked Daphne how she'd feel if her husband hired a photographer to capture her crying when he announced he was leaving her for someone else. She didn't have an answer for that. Saturday came and Genesis showed up with Hannah to get her things. I told her she could come between 10 o'clock and 4 o'clock, and she arrived right at 10 o'clock with a moving truck and 3 of her friends. I let them in and followed them around while they packed. Genesis kept making comments about how I was hovering and didn't trust her. I said, no, I didn't trust her and I'd be checking everything they took. She started going through the bedroom, taking clothes and shoes and jewelry. Most of it was clearly hers, so I didn't object. Then she tried to take some electronics that I'd bought, a tablet and a laptop. I told her those stayed. She said she'd been using them for 2 years. I said they were mine and she'd been borrowing them. We fought about nearly every item, the coffee maker, the air fryer, the fancy blender. Genesis claimed she'd bought most of it but couldn't prove it. I finally told her to just take the kitchen stuff. I didn't care about appliances. She could have anything that wasn't nailed down as long as it wasn't clearly mine. The whole process took 6 hours. By the end, Genesis had packed up most of her clothes. A bunch of kitchen items, some furniture she definitely purchased, and various other personal belongings. The house looked empty without her stuff, but also cleaner somehow. Lighter. As she was leaving, Genesis stood in the doorway and asked me if I was happy now, if this was what I'd wanted. I said what I'd wanted was a wife who didn't resent me. What I'd wanted was a partner who didn't spend 4 months planning her exit while having an affair. But since I couldn't have that, then yes, I was fine with her leaving. She said I was going to regret this, that she was going to fight me in court, that her lawyer said she had a case. I said her lawyer was welcome to try, but we both knew how this would end. The house was mine. It had always been mine. And 23 days from now she'd be completely moved out whether she wanted to be or not. She left and I closed the door on 8 years of marriage. Final update. So, it's been about 3 weeks since the last update from Hidden Lies and people have been asking what happened with the eviction and whether Genesis actually moved out. The answer is yes, but it wasn't as simple as her just accepting reality and leaving quietly. This woman fought me every step of the way and honestly it made the whole thing more satisfying. First thing that happened was her lawyer Rivers filed a motion to stop the eviction. He argued that Genesis had established tenant rights through her 5-year residency and that I couldn't just kick her out without going through proper legal channels. My lawyer responded that I had gone through proper legal channels and that Genesis wasn't a tenant. She was a spouse who'd been living in my inherited property without any legal claim to it. We ended up in court about 10 days after I'd served the eviction notice. Genesis showed up with Rivers looking professional and put together. She'd clearly prepared for this. Her strategy was to paint herself as the wronged wife who'd invested years into our home and our marriage, only to be discarded when she tried to assert her independence. Rivers argued that Genesis had made substantial contributions to the property through paying utilities, maintenance costs, and various improvements over 5 years. He tried to claim that created a constructive trust or at minimum entitled her to compensation for her contributions. My lawyer countered that paying household expenses while living somewhere rent-free didn't create property rights and that Genesis had actually benefited financially from the arrangement. The judge asked Genesis directly what improvements she'd made to the property. She talked about how she'd paid for a new water heater 2 years ago, how she'd paid for landscaping, how she'd paid for paint and minor repairs. My lawyer pointed out that all of those things were normal maintenance that any resident would be expected to contribute to, and that Genesis had been living in a 3-bedroom house in a good neighborhood without paying rent, which would have cost her at least $25,000 a year. The judge asked if Genesis had ever been on the deed or if there was any written agreement about property ownership. Rivers admitted there wasn't, but argued that didn't matter because marital property laws should apply. The judge said marital property laws were relevant to divorce proceedings, but this was an eviction case and the property in question was clearly established as separate inherited property. Genesis started crying in the courtroom. Told the judge that this was her home, that she'd lived there for 5 years and built a life there, that I was punishing her for wanting a divorce. The judge said she sympathized with Genesis's situation, but the law was clear. The property was mine. Genesis had no legal claim to it. The eviction would proceed as filed. Genesis was furious after court. She confronted me in the hallway outside the courtroom and said, I must be so proud of myself, using legal technicalities to kick her out, destroying her life because my ego couldn't handle her leaving. I told Genesis I wasn't using technicalities. I was using the actual law and the actual ownership of my property. She'd spent 4 months planning to humiliate me publicly, and now she was upset that I wasn't letting her live in my house while she did it. She said she'd never actually planned to humiliate me, that the party had been about celebrating her own freedom, not about hurting me. I reminded her about the photographer she'd hired specifically to capture my reaction, about the freedom cake, about how she'd told her friends she couldn't wait to see my stupid face. She said I was twisting everything, that I'd eavesdropped on a private conversation and taken things out of context. I asked Genesis what context made hiring a photographer to document my pain acceptable. She said she'd been emotional and venting to her friends. That people say things they don't mean when they're frustrated. I said, no, people say things they do mean when they think nobody's listening. She'd meant every word of what she'd said to Hannah and Arlene and Daphne. Rivers pulled Genesis away from me at that point. Said they needed to discuss next steps. I went home to my house that was definitely staying my house. The next week was Genesis scrambling to find a place to live. She'd been staying on Hannah's couch, but Hannah apparently had limits to her hospitality because Genesis started complaining that she needed her own space. The problem was Genesis couldn't afford much on her own. Yeah, she made 6 figures, but she'd been living rent-free for 5 years and hadn't saved as much as she should have. Plus, she'd blown a bunch of money on the party and her new wardrobe and other things related to her planned exit. She called me Tuesday evening that week from a new phone number she'd gotten. Asked if we could talk about a payment arrangement. Maybe she could pay me rent for a few months while she got her finances sorted out and found a place. I said no. She said she'd pay fair market rate. I said the house wasn't for rent, and even if it was, I wouldn't rent it to her. She said I was being unreasonable, that she just needed a little time. I said she had time. She had 12 more days before the eviction was final. She should use them productively. She said most apartments wanted first month, last month, and security deposit up front, and she didn't have that kind of cash available right now. I said that sounded like a her problem, not a me problem. Genesis asked about the car. We still hadn't sorted that out. I said she could keep the car if she refinanced it in her name only, and removed me from the title. She said she didn't have time to deal with that right now with everything else going on. I said she'd better make time because I wasn't making any more payments on it. She started crying again, said I was backing her into a corner financially, that I was systematically cutting off every resource she had. I said she'd had 8 years to establish her own financial independence. And instead she'd chosen to let me pay for things while she built up resentment. Now she was actually independent like she wanted. Thursday of that week, Judah showed up at my house alone. He said he wanted to talk man to man about Genesis's situation. I said there was nothing to discuss. He said Genesis was struggling and I was making it worse by being so inflexible. I asked Judah why he wasn't helping her. He had this great executive job and all this money according to Genesis. Why wasn't he putting her up somewhere? Judah admitted that his financial situation wasn't as solid as Genesis had believed. He made decent money, but he had student loans and some credit card debt, and his living situation really wasn't set up for her to move in. I asked if Genesis knew this. He said they'd been discussing it. I said it sounded like Genesis had jumped from one financially unstable situation to another, except at least with me, she'd had a free house. Judah said that wasn't fair. That he and Genesis had a real connection. That they understood each other in ways I'd never understood her. I said that was great and they could understand each other in whatever apartment Genesis managed to scrape together, but she wasn't doing it from my house. He asked me what I wanted. What would it take for me to give Genesis more time? I said nothing. There was nothing he could offer me that would change my mind. The eviction deadline was final. He asked if I'd always been this cold. I said no. I used to be a lot more accommodating. Genesis had cured me of that. The weekend before the final eviction deadline, Genesis showed up with her mom again. Her mom tried one more time to appeal to whatever decency I had left. Said Genesis was her daughter, and she was watching her fall apart over this. That maybe I'd been hurt by how Genesis had handled things, but this level of retaliation was excessive. I told her mom that I wasn't retaliating. I was just not continuing to provide housing for someone who didn't want to be married to me anymore. Her mom said it wasn't that simple. That Genesis had built a life in that house, that she had memories there. I said she could take her memories with her to wherever she ended up living. Her mom asked what I wanted Genesis to do. Begged me to let her stay. I said I didn't want Genesis to do anything except be fully moved out by Wednesday at 5 p.m. like the eviction order specified. Her mom said I'd changed and not for the better. I said maybe, but at least I wasn't getting walked all over anymore. Genesis tried a different approach Monday. She showed up and asked if we could talk about our marriage instead of just the house, about what had gone wrong and whether there was any way to fix it. I said there wasn't. She said she'd made mistakes with how she'd handled wanting to leave. But maybe we could work through it, go to counseling, figure out what we both needed. I asked Genesis if she was seriously suggesting marriage counseling after she'd planned a public humiliation party and been having an affair for 4 months. She said the thing with Judah was over. They'd broken up over the weekend when she'd realized he couldn't actually help her and that she'd built him up in her head as something he wasn't. I said that was unfortunate but not my problem. She said she'd been wrong about a lot of things, about me, about what she wanted, about how she'd handled everything. She thought maybe if we could just talk through things, we could find a path forward. I told Genesis the only path forward was her packing up whatever she had left and vacating my property in 48 hours. She asked if I'd really rather be alone than try to fix our marriage. I said, yes, absolutely. I'd rather be alone than be married to someone who'd spent months planning to destroy me publicly. She said she'd never wanted to destroy me. She just wanted out of a marriage that was making her miserable. I said she'd gotten what she wanted. Then she was out. Tuesday afternoon, Genesis's friends started weighing in again. Hannah sent me a long message about how I was being cruel and inflexible, how Genesis had made mistakes, but everyone makes mistakes, and I was punishing her way beyond what was reasonable. I didn't respond. Arlene tried calling me. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail saying that Genesis was falling apart and if I had any humanity, I'd at least give her another month to get settled. That friendship should count for something and they'd all known me for years. I deleted the voicemail. Daphne showed up at my workplace Wednesday morning. Yeah, she actually tracked down where I worked and came to my office. Security called me and said someone was there to see me. I went down and found Daphne in the lobby looking determined. She said we needed to talk about Genesis. I said we really didn't. She said Genesis was about to be homeless and I was the only one who could stop it. I told Daphne that Genesis wasn't going to be homeless. She had family. She had friends. She had a job that paid 6 figures. She'd figure something out. Daphne said Genesis couldn't find an apartment that would take her on such short notice. That everywhere wanted deposits she didn't have or had waiting lists or wouldn't accept her because she technically was still married and the eviction showed up on background checks. I said Genesis should have thought about that before planning the freedom party. Daphne said I needed to let go of the party. That Genesis had apologized for it. I said Genesis had apologized for getting caught, not for planning it. There was a difference. Daphne said I was being impossible and walked out. 5 p.m. Wednesday came. I'd arranged to be at the house to ensure Genesis was actually out. She showed up around 4 o'clock with a moving truck and Hannah and Arlene helping her. They loaded up the last of her belongings, clothes she'd left behind, some books, random personal items. Genesis kept looking at me like she expected me to stop this at the last minute to tell her it was all a lesson and she could stay. I didn't say anything, just watched them pack and load everything. At 4:45, Genesis stood in the driveway and asked me one more time if this was really what I wanted, if I was really going to do this. I told her to leave her key on the kitchen counter on her way out. She said she couldn't believe I'd become this person. I said I couldn't believe she'd planned to photograph me crying when she left me, but here we were. She left the key and drove away. Hannah and Arlene gave me disgusted looks as they followed her. I went inside and changed all the locks again just to be safe. The house was mostly empty now. Genesis had taken a lot of the furniture she'd bought, a lot of the kitchen stuff. The place looked bare, but it also looked like mine again, like a space I could actually breathe in without feeling her resentment saturating every room. My lawyer called Thursday to confirm the eviction had been completed. Asked if there had been any issues. I said no. Genesis had moved out on time. He said to let him know if she tried to return or cause problems. I said I would, but honestly, I thought Genesis was done fighting. She'd lost and she knew it. I'm not going to pretend this whole thing hasn't been intense. Yeah, I spent 2 years preparing for something like this, but actually executing it was different than planning it. Watching Genesis realize that her grand exit plan had backfired completely, that her affair partner couldn't actually provide for her, that she'd blown up her marriage and lost her housing and alienated people all for a freedom that turned out to be a lot more complicated than she'd anticipated. Some people in the comments have asked if I feel bad for her. The honest answer is no, not even a little. She'd planned to humiliate me in front of 30 people. She'd hired a photographer to capture my pain. She'd laughed with her friends about what a loser I was. She'd been having an affair for months while living in my house. Everything that happened to her was a direct consequence of her own choices. I didn't make her throw a freedom party. I didn't make her hire a photographer. I didn't make her cheat with Judah. I just stopped providing her with resources while she did all of those things. The question people keep asking is what happens now with the divorce? We're moving forward with it. Obviously, Genesis's lawyer is still trying to claim she should get something from the marriage, but my lawyer is pretty confident we can keep everything separate. She gets her salary and her car once she refinances it. I keep my house and my accounts and everything I had before the marriage. Genesis sent me one final message Friday from her new number. Said she hoped I was happy with myself, that I'd destroyed everything we'd built together, that she'd never forgive me for how I'd handled this. I didn't respond, but I thought about pointing out that we hadn't built anything together. I'd inherited a house and she'd lived in it while resenting me, but there was no point in continuing the conversation. I'm done with Genesis. Done with her resentment and her contempt and her conviction that she was the victim in all of this. She wanted freedom and she got it. She just didn't get to take my house with her when she left. And to everyone who's been following this story on Hidden Lies, yeah, this is probably it for updates unless something major changes. Genesis is out. The eviction is complete. The divorce is proceeding. I won exactly what I wanted to win. My property, my dignity, my right to stop supporting someone who hated me.